Well, good morning. Is this coming through all right? Can you hear this all right? Okay. All right. Well, I'll open us in prayer. Thank you, Father, for the steadfastness of your word and the unshakability of your kingdom. And thank you that we know how the story ends. And thank you that you have invited us to be a part of your kingdom. And I pray that you would help us now as we look at saints who have lived before us and the triumphs they've had and the failures they've had. I pray that you would help us to learn from their lives, to take the lessons that you would have us to take, and to be more like you in the way that we live our lives today. And help us now in Jesus' name, amen. So, review from last week, from the last couple of weeks really. We talked about how first 300 years of the church was persecution, how Constantine ended that persecution in 312 AD and honored Christianity in the empire. Many Christians began to think that this dramatic shift signaled perhaps the coming of God's final kingdom to earth. But it turned out not to be the case. Rome falls to the barbarians in 476 AD. What used to be this glorious empire of order and law descends into chaos. And the early part of the Middle Ages really are, they fit better with the name of the Dark Ages, just because it was a time of a lot of chaos and destruction. Really the only institution that holds together during this time of chaos is the church. And the church preserves many things. It preserves knowledge of the past. It preserves skills of different crafts like architecture and making just about anything you can think of. It preserves knowledge of agriculture, how to raise crops and animals. And most importantly, it preserves Scripture and continues to make copies of the Scripture when Scriptures could only be made by hand. Really tedious job. So society begins to look increasingly to the church for its order and for its leadership. We said it would be similar to if our local government completely collapsed and the church was basically the only thing still maintaining any cohesive order. The community would likely look to the church at that point. And so with that, the church grew in influence, grew in resources and wealth. And with the increase in wealth and resources came new temptations that always come along with power and wealth. And remarkably, many of the conquering barbarians, these barbaric tribes that came down from the north or from the borders of the empire and had wrecked the empire, but many of these barbarians actually began to convert to the Christian faith. And this was, again, not what you would normally expect to happen, right? So that's just a review from the last couple of weeks. Any thoughts on these ideas from the last few weeks? All right, we're going to cover, this is a little bit artificial, these dates, but the Middle Ages are roughly from 500 AD to 1500 AD. And this 1,000-year period, we're going to move through fairly quickly. Maybe you'll be relieved to learn that we're not going to spend as much time in the next 1,000 years as we spent on the last 300 years or the last 500 years. We said that society, civil society, increasingly looks to the church to provide leadership amongst the chaos of a disintegrating order, social order. Part of this has to do with the rise of the office of the Pope. Realize you would get a different interpretation of some of these things from some of our Catholic friends, but I think this is historically accurate. We're going to talk about this a little bit. The rise of the office of the Pope was gradual. In other words, the next guy living after Peter as the Bishop of Rome did not think of himself as the Pope or the leader of the church in the entire world. The position of Pope arose sort of as a response to these chaotic events that were going on in society. So the leader of a church in a local area was called the bishop. And the Bishop of Rome, not surprisingly, of the city of Rome, was not surprisingly the most well-known and influential bishop oftentimes in the church in the West. So the Pope, who first calls himself the Pope and first begins to think of himself probably as the Pope more in the way that we think of the Pope today, was Pope Leo. And he actually was the bishop of the church in Rome slightly before the fall of Rome. You'll notice this is about 25 years before the fall of Rome. So Attila the Hun, rings a bell or not, but he was a barbarian warlord from Central Asia, and he's conquering his way across Central Asia and into Europe. And he fights his way all the way to the gates of Rome, and his goal is to take over the city of Rome because it's the capital of the empire. And as he's marching up to the city gates, Rome's emperor, they still had an emperor at this point for another 25 years, he was assassinated by his own staff because of internal political mess and wrangling, right? And so there's complete chaos, as you can imagine. Law and order has broken down in the city. Nobody knows who's in charge. And so when they try to figure out who's going to go outside the city gates and negotiate with Attila the Hun, they say, well, why not send the bishop, right? Because he's the... We'll see what happens to him. So they sent Leo out to the outskirts of Rome to negotiate with Attila the Hun. And again, against all odds, historians still aren't quite sure why this happened, but he manages to talk Attila the Hun into leaving, to turning around and leaving Rome. And so you can imagine Leo, as he comes back into the city, this is quite the feather in his cap, right? And so his credibility increases enormously in the city, where there's a big power vacuum because the emperor has just been assassinated. So Leo is the first bishop of Rome that we have record of who sort of articulates this link, this unbroken link back to Peter. Right? Catholic doctrine teaches that, based on Matthew 16, that Peter is the first pope and that all of the popes after him are in a direct, unbroken line back to Peter. I won't go into some of the theological dispute about that. But at any rate, Leo was the first pope to probably see himself that way. I know you don't like this word, evolution, but I think it works here. Okay.
Peter wasn't really a pope, though, was he?
No, Peter was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. He did appear to have some kind of leadership role among the 12. But it's interesting, if you look at the church in Acts, James actually appears. Peter has a very prominent position, but James is called the head of the church in Jerusalem Peter wasn't even from Rome. Tradition tells us, it's probably correct, that he probably died in Rome. He was executed in Rome. But if he lived in Rome, it was for a very, very small percentage of his life. And the church in Rome wasn't started by Peter. I don't believe it was even started by Paul. So he wasn't really the bishop of Rome to begin with. And I think it's a stretch to say that he saw himself as infallible, and his teaching, being the infallible guide for the church for the rest of history. I mean, Peter's flaws are more on display than most of the other apostles. That's not to say he didn't have a leadership role among them. He did have a leadership role, right?
I think you're right. There really is no intelligent design of
I knew you would appreciate that, Nathan.
that.
Yeah.
Won't
Yeah. Okay. So, I don't know if you remember this. This may have gotten lost in the sauce a little bit, but Rome had gotten so big it was hard to manage, and so it had been divided into an eastern half and a western half of the empire. And the western capital was Rome, the city of Rome, and the eastern capital was Constantinople, named after Constantine. So Constantinople actually it lost most of its territory, but the city itself and its immediate surroundings maintained its stability much longer than Rome did, almost 1,000 years longer than Rome. And so the bishop of Constantinople doesn't rise to the level of political power because there isn't really a political power vacuum like there is in Rome. Does that make sense? So you don't have this idea. Constantinople likes to think of itself as the capital. Rome likes to think of itself as the capital. And the church in Constantinople likes to think of itself as the most important church. The church in Rome likes to think of itself as the most important church. So we'll see more conflict between those two groups. In the west of Europe, that is Rome, where the civil government is always teetering on the edge of disaster, the powerful bishop of the city of Rome, steps in to fill this gap in law and order and authority, and he becomes a very powerful figure politically. Does that make sense? So this gap between the eastern branch of the church in Constantinople and the western branch of the church in Rome is only going to widen out as society breaks down, law and order breaks down, roads break down. There's less and less communication between the two, and they pull in more and more different directions over time. And as this happens, the church in Rome begins to argue for the primacy of the Roman church. In other words, the highest authority belonging to the church in Rome and the bishop in Rome. And he begins to exercise more and more political authority, not just churchly authority, but actual significant influence. Often the most powerful influence politically in society is exercised by the church. So, but not until the 500s AD does he go by the title of Pope. Pope basically means father, papa, same root word. At times, we're jumping ahead now, at times the office of Pope will become deeply, deeply corrupt in its use and abuse of political power. Some of the worst time periods were between 900 AD and 1050 AD, that 150-year period, and then between 1300 and 1550 AD. And if you know your Reformation history, that happens in the latter part of this period. It's sort of in response to some of the deepest levels of corruption. But not until, most people don't realize this, it didn't become official church doctrine until 1870, official Roman Catholic Church doctrine, that the Pope's infallibility is declared formally in 1870.
Was that retroactive infallibility?
Yeah, they would have thought him, retroactively declared infallible. So, and there are a lot of things that were believed to be true about the Pope that weren't codified until 1870, but it didn't become official doctrine.
I'm just meaning,
Yeah.
they see the abuses during those time periods and say that the Pope was infallible.
Yeah, I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this. The infallibility, it doesn't mean he's a sinless individual in Catholic doctrine. It means that when he speaks ex cathedra, meaning from his throne, when he makes an official pronouncement, it is without error, it's infallible.
That's ironically called the papal bull when he speaks in his
Right. Right. So we'll come back to you can see how this affects church-state relations, right? We'll come back to this in a little bit. I do want to return to this idea because it is, to me, a reminder that Christ has promised to build his church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. The remarkable conversion of pagan Europe to Christianity. These are, think Vikings, right? Where the victors, the pagan barbarians, they end up often worshiping the god of the people that they conquered, which is sort of opposite of how it normally happens. And Western culture has been dramatically influenced because Europe as a whole largely began to recognize Christianity as the truth of things, right? Of the truth of the world. So there was a lot of courageous missionary work done by monasteries. A lot of missionaries got themselves killed, taking the gospel to the pagan barbarians. But there were more and more Christianization of these pagan societies. Right, I think we sometimes tend to forget that 2,000 years ago, I think everybody in this room, most everybody's white. Most of our ancestors were running around the forests of Northern Europe, worshiping the sun and the moon and having animal sacrifices, and those were our people, right? And the reason that's not us anymore is because of this work during this time period. So obviously the Spirit of God using a flawed church, a flawed system, God can write straight with a crooked stick, right? Thankfully.
Was the church overly evangelistic?
So the monasteries were quite evangelistic. They saw themselves as outposts. So they would go set up a monastery in a pagan area, and they were aggressively evangelistic. The church, maybe the church in Rome they were more concerned about internal processes and internal stability, whereas the monasteries were more out, trying to spread Christianity outside where it had been. So.
Crusades happened right around
So about 1,000, roughly 1,000 AD. So we haven't gotten to those yet. So with the conversion of the barbarians, often it's not what we think of in terms of a Billy Graham service with an altar call. Often what happened in these societies, and keep in mind, you had a bunch of little warlords and a bunch of little city-states. It was more like the time of Israel, right? Where you had all of these little kings, and the king may only rule a 5-mile radius, right? It's as much as he can seize and hold on to. So you don't really have nation states at this point. The empire broke down. You don't really have nation states on the scale that we have today. It's individual little kings with their individual little, 10 square mile kingdom, right? But often a king would convert, and then he would say, okay, everybody in my kingdom, all 3,000 of you, we're all going to be Christians, right? So we talk about top-down conversion, where a king would declare his whole country Christian. Now, we can think of lots of obvious problems with that, right? Is that a real conversion? What's actually going on in people's hearts? There's lots of problems about this. But one of the things, are there any strengths if a king declares his country to be Christian overnight? If he says, okay, we're going to institute we're going to take our law code and we're going to rewrite it according to biblical principles, right? That's a good thing, right? So we're going to organize our state around. We're going to try to pursue justice now instead of just whoever the most powerful guy is gets to run everything, and so the weaknesses I think are pretty obvious to us. But there are some positive effects of this in society as the leader says, okay, we're all going to try to live by this. We're all going to try to honor God's law in our law, in our social ethic. We could spend a lot of time getting into the weeds on this. Hoping to maybe not get too bogged down in this, but. Again, our focus is on the relationship between the church and the state, and so that's what we'll try to stay focused on. One of the next big things that happens, this is about 600 AD, you have the rise of Islam in Saudi Arabia, what's modern-day Saudi Arabia, a guy named Muhammad, and Islam manages to expand very rapidly through military conquest. In Christian teaching, in the teaching of Jesus, the kingdom of God does not advance by force of arms. It doesn't advance by killing people. Not so in Muslim doctrine. In Muslim doctrine, they're perfectly fine with converting people at the point of the sword, killing them or forcing them to convert at sword point. There's no doctrinal problem with that in Islam. In fact, it's a preferred way to convert people. So that does provide an interesting thought contrast with Christianity. You could spend some time thinking about that. By 730 AD, so within 120 years, this green territory, this is the Mediterranean Sea here, right? This had all been very, very heavily Christianized under the Roman Empire. The green is all the areas that Islam had taken over within 120 years, mainly through military conquest, right? And so if a town had been Christian, they forcibly convert it to Islam, and they say, if you're not going to convert, then we're going to kill you. So through military conquest, North Africa had been very, very Christian, and it got overrun. This was the area in purple is the area that was still claimed by Constantinople in the east. And you see the Muslims pushed all the way up into Spain. They took over pretty much all of Spain, and they were actually pushing up into this blue is what's modern-day France. They're actually crossed the what's the mountain range there? Pyrenees, thank you. Yeah, and they were pushing up into France, conquering in the name of Islam. So this was most of the cities of the early church. Jerusalem was a main center of the church. Antioch, the main center of the church. Alexandria. All of those cities got overrun by Islam. So finally, in 732 AD, the Muslim invading armies were working up through up through Spain, had overrun all of Spain, were up into southern France, and they are finally stopped at a famous battle called the Battle of Tours. Tours is a place in southern France. And they were stopped by the French. So the French did actually one time win a war. They were called the Franks at that point, but it's modern day French. So again, the Frankish king who led this army gained a lot of street cred overnight, right? Because he was finally the guy who stopped the Muslim armies. And so the Pope in Rome says, I want this guy on my side because he was able to do what nobody else was able to do, which was stop the horde, the ravaging horde of these Islamic armies. And so, the Frankish king has this new power and prestige after stopping the Muslims, and he converts to Christianity. I won't go into that whole story, but somewhat similar way to the way that that Constantine had a conversion to Christianity. So in 800 AD, this is a couple generations of this king later, the Pope crowns this king as Charles the Great, Charlemagne in French, and he is the new Roman Empire. The desire is to resurrect this Roman Empire, which used to be this glittering model of order and law and roads, and in which the church had assumed this very significant role. And everybody wants to get the band back together. And let's get the empire back together, and let's do it like we did it before, right? So maybe this really powerful guy, Charlemagne, maybe he can be the new emperor of a remade Roman Empire, and he'll be good buddies with the Pope. And this is the great dream. So Charlemagne being crowned as the Holy Roman Emperor is an attempt to revive this glory and the order and the stability of the old Roman Empire. It doesn't ever really work, but that's what they're aiming at. So I should probably stop. There's a lot going on. Any thoughts or questions, or does this make sense?
Are those portraits, like the portrait of Charlemagne, is that
I don't think.
somewhat historically accurate?
I don't know.
Oh.
I doubt it, because we're talking 1,200 year, something that would have had to survive. There are Roman emperors whose marble busts have survived, and we think that's what they actually look like. But I doubt it. No.
So is the Christianity Protestant?
There is no Protestant or Catholic. It's just Christianity. So this is still 700 years before the split that gives us the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. So it is hard for us to get our brains around the idea that there was just one church. It's not to say that it was monolithic, that it looked exactly the same everywhere, but there had not yet been any major conscious split where you get different denominations or different. At this point, they would still there would still be lots of internal disagreements and disagreements about how to do things, but it was still seen as one church, one body, worldwide. Yeah. But
What was other than a different person in charge of, what was the difference between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman? What was their divide?
we'll come to that in just a little bit. What they divided over, but their worship would have looked, in a lot of ways, fairly similar to one another, and even to this day, if you walked into an Eastern Orthodox church versus a Roman Catholic church, we as Protestants would think those two look more alike than a suburban evangelical megachurch, right? We'll hopefully we'll answer your question a little bit more as we go forward. So Christendom, we try to define this idea of Christendom before, which is this close marriage between the church and the state, right? Where these two things are merged. And so, in one sense, the church leadership has this political power, even to the point of coercive military power. And we talk about Peter, Jesus said, "Put away your sword, Peter," and Peter has sort of refound his sword, so to speak. And the state also exerts a lot of control over the church and often financially supports the church. So this gets really messy. This trying to work out the relationship between the church and the state. But the Pope, as he crowns Charlemagne the head of the free world, basically, this obviously gives a lot of power and influence to the Pope as a kingmaker, right? But it shows that the Pope also still needs the king. The reason he hitched his wagon to the king is because the king stopped the bad guys, right? So, and so you have this persistent problem that's going to endure for centuries, which is who's ultimately has the final say? Is it the king or is it the Pope? If those two guys get into conflict, who has the final word, right? Who has the trump card? So a lot of what's going to be worked out in this relationship between the church and the state for the next number of centuries is this trying to resolve this tension of they're working together, but if they disagree, who comes out on top, right? So the papacy also becomes, because it has an awful lot of power and an awful lot of wealth now, becomes really vulnerable to some really ugly kinds of corruption. Thoughts on that before we go on to this next idea? Last.
Were there genuine believers there? Were they talking about Christ?
Yes, I believe. So this is a hard question to answer, but I don't think the Holy Spirit went on vacation for the first 1,500 years of the church, right? I think God was still at work. There were lots and lots of people who genuinely believed in Jesus, who believed that he died for their sins, who believed that he was king, who believed that you needed to follow him and give your life to him. There were lots and lots of people throughout this period who believed that. There were people in church leadership who believed that. There were also people who were really corrupt. It's just a kind of a big sauce with a lot of stuff in it, right? But somehow we are people who believe what Jesus said when he said, "I will build my church," and it is going to prevail. And no matter how messy it gets, he's going to ensure that the bride of Christ does not completely die or disintegrate or disappear, right? That's what I think that's what we believe, right? And so there have now if you were put in a time machine and dropped back into this time period, can I tell who the genuine believers are and who I can't tell that now. Right? I don't know if that answers your question, but
Who are the church fathers or the people that we're still reading now who are commenting on the state of the church at this point? Do you know?
Because we're covering about 500 years this
But
morning.
I'm thinking like
Yeah.
Charlemagne, that time, so 800
Yeah.
to 1,000.
Well,
Or is there anybody
Well,
who's-
I think Patrick and St. Patrick of Britain and Ireland at this time, Columbus, Columbanus, not Columbus. These were guys who were, these were a couple of names. They're not necessarily theologians, they're more missionaries, but yeah. Yeah, this period of the first part of the Middle Ages is still pretty chaotic, and there's probably fewer clear voices. Like Augustine is maybe one of the last guys before it kind of goes dark, and then we'll start to see more voices emerging. Okay, so Buck, you asked about Constantinople in the east versus Rome in the west. The Eastern Orthodox Church, like we said, Constantinople, the city, and it's, I don't know, maybe thousands of square miles that it still has control over, but it's still holding. It has not fallen to the Muslim armies. Surprisingly, it's really well fortified because of where it was situated. But much of its territory was lost to the Muslims. And in Constantinople, you still have this very close relationship between the church and the state, not as antagonistic as it was in Rome between church and state. Constantinople sends missionaries north into Russia, and the Russian kings are officially converted. 950 AD, Russia declares itself to be Christian. This would be Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Constantinople version of Christianity. And so then Russia begins to view itself maybe as the inheritor of this old Roman Empire. In fact, the term Tsar in Russian comes from the word Caesar, who was the head of the Roman Empire, right? So they're trying to recreate themselves as the inheritors of the Roman Empire. Okay, this is the first great split in the history of the church. It's known as the Great Schism in 1054 AD. So we're now 1,000 years after Jesus, right? Constantinople in the east is increasingly disconnected from the Roman Church in the west. And they get in an argument. I can't remember exactly what the nature of this specific argument is. But the Roman Church is increasingly hitching its wagon to kings in the west, like Constantine, like Charlemagne. And then in 1054, the Pope in Rome sends an ambassador to the leader in Constantinople, and he tells the leader that he and all of his people are excommunicated formally from the church. The Constantinople returns the favor, then they say, no, you are. So this is what's known. We kind of chuckle. All of the infinite divisions of the church are not I don't think that's is a happy thing. I don't think that's a pleasing thing to Christ. But it's what we have. Some of this stuff is going to be from your high school history class. Maybe just some real brief tour through the context of the Middle Ages. Feudalism becomes the kind of the economic system. Money is no longer used because people don't trust it. They don't know who's standing behind it. The main source of wealth is land for agricultural purposes, just to be able to grow food. The land is owned by these feudal lords, and the peasants live on the land and they farm it. They don't own it. The feudal lords allow the peasants to farm it in exchange for giving them the best of their crops every year, and then also in exchange for the peasants fighting in the wars for the feudal lords to fight against other feudal lords. That's feudalism in 30 seconds. The kings, and again, it's more, think of it more not in terms of big empires and big nations. Think of it more in terms of little warlord kings with their little fiefdoms, their little 10 square mile kingdoms, right? They're not united. The church does have this more coherent, united body, but of course the church leaders are still very influential at the grassroots level in society, and so the kings often try to manipulate the church leaders into doing what they want politically. The process, something that becomes known as simony, it's taken from Acts 8. Anybody remember, not Simon Peter, but this Simon the sorcerer who sees, I think it's Peter and John doing miracles, and he's like, I want to do that too, how much does it cost? And they say, you can go to Hades with your money. And so that became known as simony, the idea that if you're often it was second, the firstborn son became the lord of the manor, and the secondborn son was out of luck. So maybe he could buy a position of being the local bishop or the local priest, and then he would have influence, right? Politically, I'm not talking about because he wanted to serve Jesus. It's because he wanted to have power and influence. And so this became really common, the buying and selling of religious roles like priest and bishop and archbishop for money, right? So this is not a good thing. And the church is becoming really, really increasingly corrupt and increasingly mired in the messiness of just the scramble for power and control and the way of the world, right? So the monasteries, again, often become this kind of the thing that preserves everybody else. When everything else has gone to heck, sometimes the monasteries are where renewal comes from. So at this point in time, the papacy has become really corrupt. Popes who have multiple concubines and multiple bastard children from multiple women, and just a mess. And so the monasteries say we really, really, really need to reform the church to get it back to looking to something like what Jesus was teaching about in the Bible. And so the monks manage, in some cases, to actually move into upper level leadership of the church. Some of them even become popes. It's about this time period celibacy was not a requirement of a priest in the church prior to this period. And the monks think there's so much sexual corruption with the priests that we need to have celibacy to address that kind of corruption in the priesthood. So celibacy becomes the law of the church at this point for priests. So this next story, true story, you could really make a movie out of this. It would be a super interesting movie. This is one of these episodes that is it's emblematic of a really fascinating story that sort of symbolizes a whole lot of other stuff that's actually going on. So we'll see this conflict between the king and the pope break out into kind of open warfare. So as some people within the church are trying to reform the church from within in good ways, that's going to lead to conflict with the kings. So in many cases, it was the local king who would pick the bishop or buy the bishop. And the church is saying, no more. The church is now going to pick its own priests, its own bishops. These positions aren't for sale anymore. We're going to grab the reins of leadership within the church, right? And so the popes, trying to regain some control and assert their right to choose who the church leaders will be. It's at this point in time that the College of Cardinals is created. This is the body who chooses the next pope. A lot of the popes up to this point had actually acquired enough wealth to buy the position. Okay, so we have a pope who's one of the most prominent popes in the history of Catholicism. His name is Gregory VII, and he's trying to reassert the headship of the church over the state. So Henry is the Holy Roman Emperor. He's German, and he says, I'm going to pick whatever bishops and archbishops I want. And Gregory says, no, you're not. And Henry says, yes, I am. And so Pope Gregory excommunicates Henry, the most powerful king in the world. He excommunicates him from the church. And Henry says, well, you're an imposter. You're not a real pope. So we have this showdown between these two guys, the most powerful emperor in the Western world and the pope. Gregory excommunicates the emperor Henry and says, your people who are Christians no longer have to do what you say, which is a really big deal politically, right? And even more than that, it gets even worse to where Gregory says, I'm not just going to excommunicate you, the king, I'm going to excommunicate all your people from the church unless they depose you and replace you with somebody else. So this is a super, super powerful lever that the Pope has to try to manipulate the kings, right? And so in this famous, so the people under Henry are like, wait, we're all getting excommunicated. You gotta go apologize. And so Henry makes this barefoot trek to Rome in the winter to apologize formally to Pope Gregory, who makes him wait outside in the snow for 3 days. He's really rubbing it in, right? And he doesn't believe that it's sincere, which almost certainly it was not sincere. He's being forced to do this. So eventually, after 3 days, Gregory, the Pope, says, I absolve you, you're forgiven, you can still be king, but you know where you belong, so you can go home now. So Henry goes back to Germany and then stews the whole way there, and then he decides, I'm going to take an army and I'm going to go back. I'm going to show the Pope who's boss. And so he does that. Henry marches back to Rome with an army looking for revenge. And Gregory actually has to flee and ends up dying in exile. And Henry, the emperor, appoints a new pope who the church does not recognize. Anyway, this just illustrates the real collision between trying to figure out, when you have a close relationship between the church and the state, how do you figure out who's on top and who's not, right? So, but what Gregory, in managing to show up the emperor, to stand down the emperor, a lot of people would point to this as this is the time period when the papal power reached its absolute peak, right? He made the emperor wait in the snow barefoot for 3 days, right? Okay, so all of this raises the question, what does this have to do with anything with us, right? The debates over relationship between church and state, those are still live debates today. Not these same kind of debates. We don't have President Biden going to the Pope and begging for forgiveness. We don't have those kind of things. But there's always a tension between, in society, does the civil government get to tell the church what to do, or does the church get to tell the civil government what to do? What happens when they disagree? So in some ways, these kinds of conflicts have been with us forever, and they're not ever going to be resolved until the king, the true king, comes back and establishes who is the true king and the true high priest, and he combines all of those, has all power in himself. Until that happens, we're probably going to continue having these kinds of conflict between the church and state. But it does, part of the Protestant Reformation was saying, maybe we need to detach a little bit from this super close relationship between church and state that seems to make a big mess out of everything. And so, Christians today in America sometimes get accused of being theocratic. What is that word, being a theocracy? Yeah, where the church just wants to run society, right? I don't think, personally, I don't want to run Central City. It would be a lot of headache. I don't want Heartland to have the hassle of running the police department and the sheriff's department and the city sewage plant and the water treatment plant and the Department of Roads and the local public schools. I don't want to run all those things, right? It would be a radically different job description for Zeke if he was in charge of a church that was running the whole civil society, right? It would require a very different staff than the staff he currently now has, pastorally, right? So what we want is for our pastoral staff to focus on preaching the Word and being faithful to the Word. And what do we want from people who are running our civil society? Well, I think we want people who are competent. Right? I want someone running the electrical grid who knows something about electricity and who's competent at running the grid. And I hope he trusts in Christ, but he doesn't have to trust in Christ in order to keep the power on, right? So, never mind, during the Middle Ages, the Pope actually had his own army. So I really don't want to be in charge of the military or to have some American priest or pope or pastor who's in charge of the U.S. military. I do want people who are running these civil offices to do it in ways that are just, that are in alignment with God's teachings about what is real and what is not real, what is good and what is bad. So we want our society to operate in ways that are just, that are in alignment with God's moral law of the universe, right? And we want
fun.
What's that?
Dream on.
Yeah, this is what we would want. For most times and most places in history, this is not what we've actually had. But Pastor Zeke this morning referenced the passage from Jeremiah, and because we do love our neighbors, because I love my children, and I hope to someday have future grandchildren, and I care about the society that they live in. I don't want them to live in chaos. Right? I don't want them to live in a society where it's completely broken down into warlordism and where might makes right. And that's not what I want for my neighbors. It's not what I want for my kids, my future grandkids. So I do want a society that honors God's law, right? I think we all want that. That's when we vote a certain way, we're voting according to what we think will be the most likely to preserve that kind of a society for our children and grandchildren and for our neighbors. Not just because, not just because we hate our neighbors, but because we want a just society that honors God, right? I assume everybody who goes to the polls in a couple of weeks is voting in an attempt to preserve a society or to claw back a society or to influence society in a way that is toward godly principles. Does that make sense? Not many times and places have Christians actually succeeded in really securing a godly society. And even if we do succeed by God's grace in securing it, it's fragile, right? We're not guaranteed that my society is going to go on forever without being corrupted, without every new generation. There has to be renewal within the church. There has to be renewal within society, or gravity tends to just work in one direction, right? Which is down, right? So I realize there's a lot of big thoughts in here. What are you guys thinking as you process this?
We seem to have such a propensity to think that we can wash our hands of our own personal responsibility in our own neighborhoods, in our own homes, in our own communities by electing the right person. Well, I'll elect this person, then I can just go about being selfish and burying my nose in the ground and ignoring everything going on around me.
Right.
And because I elected the right person, I'm now free from my responsibility to be a decent citizen and to care about people around me. That never in the history of the world has a country or a society turned to God wholeheartedly because of the politician that was elected
Right.
or installed.
Right.
I mean, the best thing they can do is, like Constantine declaring it to be a Christian nation. He changed the conversation about what the values were going to be going forward. That is valuable. Absolutely.
Yeah. I completely agree with what you just said. Part of the goal of this class was to get people to think about politics as not presidential elections every 4 years. That's just that is part of what politics is, but it's way broader than that, right? And so many of the things that the church does as acts of loving their neighbor are political acts that have nothing to do with elections every 4 years. So I completely agree. We tend to vest too much hope, I think, this is my opinion, in, if we can just get this person elected or we can just get that person out of office, then everything's going to be awesome, right? But it's just not true. There's a lot of politics, there's a lot of things that have to do with society that don't have a lot of influence, that aren't going to change much depending on who's elected. Now, does that to say it doesn't matter? It does matter. All these things, leadership matters, stuff trickles down. It does matter, but it also matters, how I treat my neighbor, my involvement in my local community. Mark, I feel like you have some thoughts on this.
It's just, I wonder where in the church history, where the personal relationship with Christ was all the way down through there. 'Cause that's odd.
Well, a whole lot of people lost sight of that, clearly. A whole lot of people in leadership completely lost sight of that. We're doing opposite things, even with giving lip service to it.
And then, I mean, I've often argued the same thing, that, you know, I want my doctor to be well trained in the surgery I'm going into. Does it matter if he's a believer or not?
Mm-hmm.
And you cross that over to the political side. But it does when you look at the whole of society, when you look
Mhm.
at how our politicians are campaigning and the things that they're doing. Really harsh dialogue and really, and just
Mhm.
as he was talking this morning, it seems like that does make a difference if they're
Right.
as
And
they
and they're
go about their process of leading
right.
as well.
And when it comes to beliefs and worldview and what's good, there is no neutral position, right? So, we think we're a secular society. We're not a secular society. We just don't admit to being. We're as religious as ever. You listen to these debates over trans, or all of those are invested with huge emotions from the left. We're saying this is a right and wrong issue. So it's just there is no such thing. Nature abhors a vacuum, right? And morally too. If Christianity was the prevailing view about what was true in the world, and that's leaking out, it's going to be replaced by some other religious system about what it means to be a human being and what it means to live a good life or not. And there is no neutral position on any of those things, right? And so that's why Christians we can't just check out of all of that stuff and then say, woe is us when it goes south, because that's not loving our neighbor very well.
I still think there's a really great term in politics where I still like is politics is conflict without trust.
Mm.
So when you think about that, the function of conflict, which inevitably we as a society have, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you don't have trust involved in the conflict, it becomes political.
Mm.
And I think that's where believers being in that space, helping people come together in a way that has an atmosphere of trust, not turn around and backstabbing
Mm-hmm.
immediately the next day. There is a function of how politics can function
Mm-hmm.
with believers
Mm-hmm.
working in a way that is biblical.
I would say we live relative to all of human history, we live in communities that are stable. People aren't shooting each other out on the streets like they are in many places in the world right now. Our state government functions pretty well. Is it perfect? No, but again, people aren't shooting each other, right? Right? The economy, maybe we think it's not great right now. Our system is 99% of the people in the history of the world would love to live right here in this time and place. That's why so many people are trying to get in, right? Because this is a good place that has operated remarkably well for quite a while, for a couple of centuries, not by accident, because it was set up structurally, recognizing a lot of God's teaching, things that are true about reality, right? And so, and we all are chagrined to see trends and declines in that. But this is still a remarkably stable, prosperous place politically relative to all of human history. It really is. Yeah. And again, that's not an accident, and it's not a guarantee. Yeah.
All the more why what you were talking about last week is we want believers in the medical field and
Yeah.
teaching in
Yeah.
our schools, and we want believers infiltrating into these.
Right, salt and light, right?
Yeah, in these
Yeah,
areas.
we want believers salted into all of our politics at national levels and at local levels, and yeah, that's probably a good place to close. Chris, would you close us in prayer?